The past 5,000 years have been ones that have encompassed massive change. Although from an anthropological standpoint, it is a relatively short window of time, it is recent history. The past 5,000 years has fundamentally reshaped who we are as a species and what our collective lives look like. So it is not a boring period of time to look at, and I hope today to make it at least a little bit interesting. Now, admittedly, in making it interesting, I have some pretty stiff competition from various sort of um, TV shows that attempt to cover this period or earlier periods with very sensationalist claims. So, for example, you have TV shows like Ancient Aliens or Ancient Apocalypse, the first of which purports to find extraterrestrial influences in various things in the archaeological record. The latter of which, Ancient Apocalypse from Graham Hancock, who is not an archaeologist. Anyways, it claims that there was, among other things, a highly advanced civilization which had an apocalyptic cataclysmic event and then had to passed along its knowledge to a bunch of far more simplistic hunter-gatherer people, or so I understand it. These kinds of documentaries get millions and millions and millions of views, needless to say, and I suspect I cannot compete in terms of entertainment factor, so I probably should not even try. And indeed, I won't be trying. Instead, though, I would like to make some points about how we tell history and kind of what to look out for, and then talk about what we do know about this most recent phase of human history. So when we sometimes use a word, pseudoarchaeology, and we use it to distinguish from archaeology, specifically when there are people who are not using the scientific methods of archaeology, but are presenting it as if they have found some startling new discovery about archaeology, usually with the idea that sort of mainstream archaeology is refusing to accept this new evidence. And you oftentimes find these sorts of things perhaps late at night on a YouTube rabbit hole or something. When you contrast how archaeology sometimes gets presented in these kinds of TV shows or YouTube videos versus what archaeology actually looks like as a scientific research method in practice, you're going to see some kind of key differences. And I want to mention these. I'm sure you're already aware of most of this, but it can help you in sort of being an informed reader of the human past by finding like what is actually rooted in research and what is not. So generally speaking, archaeology, the way that we do things, it is very, very specific and narrow claims. For example, the reading that you did by Alan Boris and Anita Peter makes some very specific claims about Denina sites in a specific area, right? A specific culture during a specific time period, and why you don't find certain kinds of artifacts, but do find others, right? It's a very specific kind of claim in a very specific time and place. For anthropology, context is everything. By contrast, pseudoarchaeology often makes kind of these very grand, sweeping claims, right? To have discovered some long-lost civilization that totally influenced all of humanity, and has been obscured up till this present moment, right? Very, very large claims. And I think it's incumbent on us all to kind of ask what kind of evidence, right, would be required to make those kind of sweeping claims. Generally speaking, in archaeology, you have to very clearly present your evidence, and you also have to account for contextual factors. Whereas in kind of some kind of very convincing YouTube video, you can kind of cherry pick evidence, which might sound when you're listening to it like, whoa, this is really convincing. And then you actually dig into the evidence if you can figure out where they're drawing it from. And either A, it may not have been produced through very rigorous science, or B, it was produced through science, but the evidence, the information points are scattered through time and space, right? So in the example of Ancient Apocalypse, he's often drawing on examples that are thousands of years and thousands of miles away from each other and trying to claim that they all belong to or were influenced by this same ancient culture that disappeared, which is not the most logical thing to consider, right? When you include things in their proper context, there's usually a more straightforward example that fits the evidence better, or straightforward explanation. So for example, if one group picks up farming later than another group and they're neighbors, or they're at least relatively close neighbors, it is more reasonable to assume that in context then that they picked it up from each other, or that there was environmental conditions that caused both of those groups to pick up farming. For example, as we'll talk about here, during the Holocene, there was a warming period as Earth moved out of the most recent glacial period, the Ice Age. And so as a result, it became advantageous to many human groups to use their knowledge of seeds and things like that to develop the earliest domesticated food traditions, right? And so there's an environmental factor that makes sense for why you would get domesticated food popping up in several places within a few thousand years of each other, right? Which is sort of this changing environment and the plants that they have on hand. So contextual evidence gives us a good explanation. If you took out that context, you can make it instead sound like, oh, well, it's so shocking that all of a sudden all these groups had farming. With proper context, it's really not at all shocking, especially when you consider that they didn't literally all do it at once. It was separated often by centuries, if not millennia. Which brings us to this point that generally speaking, archaeology requires that the explanations be relatively reasonable, which of course, one person's reasonable is another person's unreasonable to some degree. But what I more mean by that is that oftentimes people making more sensationalist claims will require us to make really, really large assumptions to back up a claim that maybe the data doesn't at all warrant that being an assumption. So sort of like, well, if you assume there was this, Atlantis civilization or an ancient civilization that disappeared, well, then you can make it fit into the data, but that's like an assumption that you don't have any data for, right? You're kind of making an assumption and then fitting the data around that. In science in general, in archaeology in particular, we want to go the other way around and let our conclusions draw from our evidence and not our assumptions fundamentally shape the evidence. Now, of course, we're not perfect. The nature of science is that we criticize and correct each other over time and get better. And you've probably noticed in several of these lectures that I have a pretty critical stance sometimes on claims that we sometimes make in archaeology because there's oftentimes not as much evidence as we'd like. And yet nonetheless, it is fundamentally scientific in the sense that, again, you have to be able to justify assumptions, and really you shouldn't be making many assumptions at all that aren't clearly backed up by data or common sense. Generally speaking, archaeological research is very, very slow, and it requires many groups of people compiling data from many places over vast periods of time. If you don't already know this, archaeological fieldwork, archaeological excavation is painstaking. You have to basically document every single inch of dirt that you move and what was there. And you have, because that context is all key, right? Something being slightly lower in the soil than something else is really key because that's telling you about time and action. So it's a very slow, methodical process. And it's one that requires teams of people, right? There are thousands of archaeologists working across the world at any given moment of time. By contrast, these more sensationalist claims tend to involve sort of one individual or a few individuals who allegedly have discovered something that nobody else found, and that they did it within a single human lifespan, or sometimes even within let's say 10 years or something like that. And that's simply not how really any science, but certainly not how archaeology works in terms of its methods. That's not enough time to give proper context to the information, and it's not enough time to properly consider alternative explanations. And then finally, peer review. So a key part of sort of archaeological work in general is that it should be, generally speaking, before we publish our research, we make it available to other archaeologists or other anthropologists who can rigorously look at the information and say, does this make sense? Is this reasonable? Does your research actually support what you're claiming it supports? And they often critique it and poke holes in it, and you have to address those before you can actually publish your research. Yes, that is gatekeeping, but gatekeeping for the purpose of sort of allowing science to actually be science, right? It should be, if not replicable, at the very least, another scientist should be able to look at it and see that the data and the conclusions fit correctly and that the methods are reasonable. By contrast, a lot of times when sweeping claims are made, the people making those claims will claim that sort of mainstream archaeology is against them and have a slightly more hostile, or sometimes much more hostile, resistance towards criticism or towards critique, which, if you're doing science properly, and I would be the first to admit that scientists are not always like this, but if you are doing science properly, you should be very much open to critique because it should be allowing you to look at possible alternative explanations for your data. So All of that to say, we can all be better at this, right? All of us sometimes go down rabbit holes, but it's helpful to remember that science, better for better or worse, archaeology, we do sometimes have sudden amazing discoveries. More often than not, though, the vast majority of the time, our discoveries are slow. They are firmly rooted in the data, and they have to account for all the possible explanations and arrive at explanations that are reasonable and fitted well to the data. It's usually not terribly exciting. It usually involves years of research followed by years of other scientists having a chance to poke at the data and make sure that it stands up. Doesn't mean that everything an archaeologist finds is true, and certainly they've been wrong many times. It does mean, though, that it is more rigorously scientific than sometimes some of the sensationalist claims we'll find on YouTube.